Okay, so let's open it up, Fiona, to questions coming in from our audience. Thank you very much, Judy. That was fun.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Judy, and thank you, Deborah. That was a great conversation. We have had over 400 people join the webinar today, so we've got a lot of questions from the audience. So we're going to get started and get to as many of them as we can. The first question is from Dr. Cameron Wake, who's a research faculty and professor of climate and sustainability here at UNH. He asks, how can collaboration be more effectively rewarded in corporations? There still seems to be a reward structure that is focused on the individual, especially in terms of salary and benefits. Are there good models where rewards are based on collaborative efforts?
Well, I think are you asking me, Deborah, you have a thought on this one as well?
Please you start, Judy. I'm here.
On anything that strikes you. I think it's a design question. It takes me back to this complicated question about fixing CEO pay. What's the right relationship between the CEO and his or her direct reports? Is the way they're paid? Are they being paid as a team? Are we being paid? My analogy is always that this isn't, like as if this is an airline and the only one who matters is the pilot, not the grounds crew, not the people, the quality tinkerers and the flight attendants and the people that engage with the customer. That doesn't hold. So what's the right relationship between the CEO and his or her direct reports? What's the relationship between how we compensate and reward the management team relative to everybody else? And how much are we saying goes to the shareholders? Like, are we intentional about that? Or are we just kind of a victim to some kind of notion of legacy, and this is the way it's always been done, and peer comparisons? Well, our CEO ought to be paid as much as some other CEO somewhere else. So I think that's part of the question, is like, what are the incentive systems internal, and do people have a real sense of ownership of their enterprise? We certainly could study any number of companies that we believe really foster teamwork, and I think we'd find strong culture, and it's that's what people like you guys teach, right, at UNH, is how do you develop a culture that's resilient and robust.
That's great. Thank you, Judy. Deborah, do you want to add anything to that?
No, go ahead.
All right, wonderful. The next question is from somebody, an anonymous attendee in the audience, but says, do you think that it is inevitable that the corporate world will become sustainable and focus on ethical goals? Or do you think governments need to intervene and force the corporate world to focus on these goals?
Boy, I think it's
sorry, Judy, and a sub part of that question is, do you think such government intervention would work, especially given the partisan divides in the United States?
Especially given partisan divides. It's complicated, right? It's complicated time. Look, I think there are different attitudes in the partisan divide, about the role of government, how much is private initiative. But it's always been a dance, right? Of course we need government. And we need government, frankly, free of political interference by companies. I don't mean business doesn't have a voice. Of course it has a voice. It has a voice as employers, as creators of goods and services and important infrastructure. Of course it has a voice at the table. And we hear that voice at the table. But when you get money in politics, you start twisting the system, and those with the most money, of course, are heard more clearly, perhaps. And so I think if we could kind of free the political environment from the massive influence buying, we could get back to a point where, business, yes, it craves a rule of law, but it's not trying to influence the rule of law in the same degree. And we allow that system to get to the best possible place. But aside from that, you've got this continuing renewal that happens where for some reason there is a company that has more at risk or more to gain, and it's often the same company. It may be the one who's most exposed in some kind of domain, or just sees an opportunity that they can raise, and it's always somebody will require some risk and maybe some additional expenditure, which is why it gets into this question about, is it competitive? And so when a company, I go back to years ago, when during the AIDS crisis, where it was Prudential was the very first of the companies to say, you know what, we're going to open up life insurance policies and let the victims of HIV/AIDS access the benefits of life insurance during somebody's lifetime, so they can actually afford the kinds of treatments that allow them to lead a productive life. And that was, that wasn't a sensible thing to do in terms of competition, but it took only, it took days for everybody to follow suit, because it was obviously one of those things that just made a lot of sense to do, and it raised the brand of Prudential, and others followed suit. So you've got this is a constant change. There's constant changes happening. Sometimes it's forced, but I think it's an interesting dynamic to study.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question here, which I think takes us back to one of the questions you were asking, Judy, Deborah, but it says there has been also significant pushback on the embrace of stakeholder capitalism. For example, Jamie Dimon's board recently rejected moving JP Morgan Chase toward becoming a more stakeholder-focused enterprise. How do you assess the durability of this resistance, and what will it take to overcome it?
I don't know if I would characterize what happened the same way. I haven't read a lot about it, but I think that the board reasserted that we do have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. Yeah, of course, there's a fiduciary duty, but as I said earlier, it can't come at the expense of the long-term health of the enterprise. And the board has business judgment rule. They are able to plan and execute as long as they, in fact, they can't throw. They can't be cavalier, perhaps, about investors, but it also, there's nothing that really constrains boards from moving forward. I'd love to understand more about what that conversation was in the boardroom and what were the forces. And, it's certainly, I know the reality of what big banks have to deal with today. And I don't think there's any rolling back in terms of their interest also in making sure that they're investing appropriately. We got a long ways to go on this score. I think capital markets in particular are very complicated, and we are in a period of time, and have been for a while, where it simply feels that the benefits of capital investment are not really shared, or that the rules of investment are too, hew way too closely to maximum, profit maximization. So that you look at the venture capital industry, or maybe private equity to some degree, or other aspects of this. It's not one big monolith. Different industries operate in different ways. But there's a lot of this country that could use more investment, and our capital markets are not operating in a way that is easy to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really interesting question. How do you see companies balancing the move to introduce more AI, artificial intelligence, and automation to reduce costs, a dynamic that has been accelerated by the pandemic with the imperative to value human beings and their unique contributions?
So I missed a couple of your words there, but can you just paraphrase it again for me?
Of course. It's really about the balance between companies doing more around automation and artificial intelligence, and trying to balance that with the imperative to value human beings and their unique contributions.
I don't know. I'd love to have this audience in a big room and we could toss this one around a little bit. I'm certainly not an expert on it. We did some work with Accenture a few years back on this. There was a couple of partners there that wrote a really interesting book on AI and the ethics of it. And the piece I walked away with is that they predict that something like 20% of artificial intelligence jobs, if you will, are going to be about these ethical questions in the application of AI. It will be impossible to do this appropriately without taking that into account. One of our fellows, Joanne Stonier at MasterCard, is their chief data officer, and has been dealing with these questions around data privacy. And it's taking her and MasterCard into what do good protocols look like in this domain. So I think a lot of companies are starting to think about it. It's a lot of cacophony from the social media crowd and the tech industry and, you know, the Facebooks and the Twitters of the world in terms of how do they do this well, because they certainly can't manage the kinds of decisions that they are managing and depend entirely on kind of human judgment here. They do need artificial intelligence to support them. So I don't think we'll get to a point where the machine's going to be smarter than somebody with judgment on this. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out.
A question here from Wen John, who's a member of our finance faculty here at UNH. And she said, could you comment on which industries tend to be further along in pioneering the Aspen guiding principles for long-term value creation? Any industries in urgent need to understand the importance of such changes?
I think that I'm always drawn to the companies that there's kind of two categories. Ones that have big brands who are at risk. So, write a little bit about Nike. If you go back to the moment when, Phil Knight was running Nike and had a real wake-up call where there were accusations around child labor being used deep in the supply chain. There are many examples of this in many different companies. Was Nike the worst actor? Probably not, right? But they had the hottest brand that would be able to make the biggest political point about scrubbing your supply chain for child labor or human trafficking or any number of horrific ills that a modern company would want to be able to speak to. So I think that's one category. These brands are always vulnerable because they're they stand for something and everybody knows their name. It doesn't do any good to try to drive a campaign around a company you've never heard of. The other category are companies that they're stuck in place. So think about mining companies, oil and gas companies, companies that make massive investments in natural resources in a particular place and literally can't pick up and move. Utilities are interesting in that. We're watching this, kind of massive consequences of the fires in California and the kind of brunt, how this has fallen on GE. GE can't pick up and move. They can't say, okay, we're leaving California, we're going to open business in Wisconsin. It just doesn't work that way, right? So they're stuck in place. They have the benefit of having a kind of a free market in a way in place. So there's a quid pro quo there maybe, but it tends to be that they have to get ahead of the curve as a result, or they've learned that they have to get ahead of the curve on questions of human rights and labor conditions and the like. I'm talking now mostly those who work deep in the supply chain in different parts of the world. So I think those are two that have always struck me, these kind of consumer products on the one hand, and then these massive companies that don't realize their investment for decades or realize it over decades, that simply have to live in greater harmony with their host communities. I think those are both really interesting case examples.
Thank you. Two different audience members asked a similar question, which was you stated earlier, Judy, that 50% of young adults identify more with socialism than with capitalism. And so the question is, why do you think this is? Is it a problem, and what do you think should be done about it?
Yeah, I think it's a problem. I don't. It's a bit of a cartoon. What do we mean by socialism? I mean, it's what they're basically saying is that we don't think that the fruits of the enterprise are being appropriately shared, and I agree with them. When 90% of profits are being sent back to shareholders and companies are compelled to borrow in order to do additional share buybacks, there's something wrong here. That's not how the system is supposed to work. And so, on the other hand, the United States, we're getting very parochial here. The United States is really built on this interesting relationship between private benefit and public endearment, and we need to understand how those work together. And there's a lot of models to work with. So I think it does come back to this question of purpose. What is the company aiming toward? What are we here for? How are we communicating that? And what does that require of us in terms of the relationships we have with host communities, but taking those seriously and understanding what are the trade-offs involved if we go searching for a new place to site a manufacturing facility, but it's all about negotiating the lowest possible tax, or what kind of benefits can I get if I play off this country against, or that company against, or sorry, this county against that county. It's not a formula, you know. I mean, we need fair taxes. I was one who was glad that the tax rate came down from 36%. I thought that was too high, the corporate tax, when it came down to 24%. But now let's bring everybody up to 24% or 22% or whatever it ends up being, and make sure that we have a level playing field and sufficient revenues to actually support our public goods. It's not that complicated, right? So these are the underlying questions. I think I may have gone way off of what the point of that question was. I can't remember what it was. I've gone off on a different part of the soapbox here. So let me pull back to saying I do think that purpose is really essential to this, being thoughtful about what that means and then operationalizing it.
Yeah. Judy, we have a lot of students on the webinar today, and there's a question here from Chloe Gross, who's one of the amazing students in my class, actually. She says, how can less influential people like students help to ensure that businesses truly turn in the stakeholder direction?
Ooh, you've got all the power in the world. You get to decide where you're going to go to work. They want you. There was a real change, I think, and I'm pretty sure, Deborah, I'd like to know if you agree with this, but I think we saw a shift. It might have been a precursor of what we're seeing now in companies, where students started asking the employer question, in the privacy of interview rooms. So we have a network of kind of chief sustainability officers and heads of CSR, and we would hear from them how much they were hearing in the protocols of interviewing, how that became a moment of assuring that the company was articulating well what it stood for. So, and the other thing I'd say to your student is that, get serious about what this means. Don't get fooled by philanthropy. This is about the DNA of the company, its actual business model. The information is all there. And so I think it's part of being part of this dynamic of assuring that you're clear on what you want to do, and you have your standards and you hold to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great answer, Judy. And, I think it really speaks to the point that all of us, including students, have immense influence if we choose to wield it, right? We can vote with our feet and about where we buy, the products we buy, the companies we buy from, where we choose to work, where we choose to invest our money when we have some. So we all have power and influence. There's another question from Jason Plant, another student here at UNH. How should the role of the investment community change to more effectively usher in stakeholder capitalism?
Well, I think the investment community is made up of a lot of bits and pieces, and it's no more monolithic than shareholders overall or employees overall. It means a lot of different things. But I'd commend you to look at a couple of things. There was a wonderful article written by Charles Duhigg, who wrote The Power of Habits, if you know that book. And he writes, it was in The Atlantic a couple of months ago, and it was about the venture capital industry. And he told the story. It was a pretty deep investigation into the venture capital industry through the lens of WeWork, and how the investors identified WeWork as a prospect that they thought would be a good investment for their venture, and supported it to the degree that it could engage in essentially predatory pricing for a long period of time, wipe out the competitors. There was already a strong culture of co-working spaces. WeWork didn't invent the space, allowed them to, buy real estate right next door to the most successful, co-working space in town. And we know the result. This doesn't end well. This kind of focus doesn't end well. And so it is critically important that in capital markets, they are held to the same standard as other enterprises. what business are we in? You know, what is our goal? What are we trying to do? You know, none of this is easy, but I think there's a lot of work that has to go on in this domain. So, you know, it's, you know, Larry Fink of BlackRock, you know, the largest investor in the world, I think it's over $8 trillion under management today. You know, he's had a singular voice in raising questions about the role of investors. He's also, BlackRock is criticized for saying that there's a disconnect between what the CEO is saying and what the asset managers actually, how they actually function and how they're being paid and how that are those, so they've got their own work to do, right? It's a big enterprise and you know, it's probably the commitments and kind of elevated ideals that he is, and ideas, not ideals, ideas that he has spoken to, you know, making sure that those are played out appropriately throughout the firm is a complicated enterprise undertaking. But I think that, you know, it's about setting intentions and then working.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just do one. We've still got a lot of questions, but I know we're getting short on time. So let's just do one quick more question. Let's see. It's a question from Justine Castle, and I think it's a really, she's a student in my class, and actually I recognize this question from an exam question I posted recently. So let's see how you would answer this question.
Then get him to answer the question.
Well, she did, but I think
she's
interested to hear what you would say. So what are the kinds of solutions that the world needs, but businesses will never be able to provide? In other words, what are the limitations of stakeholder capitalism and the limitations of shared value?
You know, I don't like the word stakeholder. I think it kind of fuzzes up what we're talking about here. It's not a term that I think evokes real people and real institutions and real relationships in the way that business, in fact, actually does have to manage to. And so, you know, the clarity that's required is to actually step back from the noise, just like we need to step back from the noise of the stock market. We need to step back from the noise of stakeholder and get back again to what is our enterprise about? You know, Intel is different than McDonald's. They don't have the same purpose. They also don't have the same critical stakeholders. You know, one of them is deep supply chain, has to think about, MasterCard is McDonald's is undertaking a remarkable program of kind of being the node for massive change in raising in beef production. You know, operates in, I think 80% of the beef that they buy comes from something like 19 countries. That means, of course, there are many more countries that they're also, it's remarkable. It has huge impacts in terms of land and soil, on, you know, the kind of health of natural grasslands, clearly on climate change. It's a huge emitter. All of these things, you know, the safety of the food system, these extraordinarily complicated ideas here. So it's about identifying those pieces that are most important to do well, and demonstrating and using, I think, the agency that your enterprise has. Ultimately, the CEO has multiple jobs. It's a complicated job, but one of their jobs is, you know, in speaking as kind of, is in the leadership domain. So our expectations of the firm today as employees are that, is my CEO speaking out on things that are really critical to me as an employee? Whether it was marriage equality, Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs, that became something he became very outspoken about, right? Immigration, we saw technology companies speaking out during the Muslim visa ban era and saying, no, we're now talking about ability of our employees to, so they were clear on that, and they weighed in on policy questions that usually they stayed away from. But there's also so there's the leadership piece, and then, investing in policy. But then ultimately, the job of the CEO is not some kind of fuzzy stakeholder thing, right? It's really looking at the governance of his or her company, how decisions are made, how the rewards are shared, and where they really have choices to be brought to bear on issues of consequence. Not every company has the same levers to pull. Not everybody has the same stakeholders. And there's nothing about this that's flat. It's about saying, what's the agency for my company? Where do I have the most opportunity to really influence the nature of race relations or economic opportunity or climate change? What piece do I need to really finesse? Where's the limits of that? And where do I need to be in coalition with others? And what's the nature of partnership that really works? And how do I design? What can I learn about doing that extremely well? And where do I call on my employees and make sure that I really am investing in them? So I have the kind of eyes on the ground to identify risks that I may not see from the C-suite. But if I'm listening well, we will be ahead of the curve. So I think it's all complicated. I don't think there's certainly not one size fits all or one answer that's suitable to this question. I am hopeful, but I'm not silly about it. I know it's complicated.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on, Judy. Deborah and Judy both, thank you. This was just a terrific conversation, probably my favorite conversation in the last couple of years. Really, really important conversation, really far-reaching. Thank you both again. And I will echo what Deborah said at the beginning. Judy's new book, The 6 New Rules of Business, is one of the most important and concise books on this topic that has been published probably in the last decade. I'd like to just close with just a couple of quick comments. Events like this, I think, are important because they help remind us of the interconnectedness of our world, the critical sustainability issues that we face, and the need to find solutions that build a stronger future for all of us. So we really invite you to reflect on what you have heard today and about the power of your agency, whether you're a student, whether you're a business leader, or in some other role. But we all have agency as individual change makers and collectively as a society. And we all need to contribute to the change that we want to see in the world. We are definitely at a profound moment in the world where change is possible, but we know we need to work collaboratively together to get the future right. We certainly need governments to step up and take action. Universities like our own, nonprofits must do their part too. But today we really focused on the role of the corporate sector. You've heard from our speakers today both a bold vision and the reality of how corporations can fundamentally redesign their approaches, their business models, and ultimately redesign the rules of business. And in the process, fundamentally redesign our economy so the future is one that is truly sustainable. At UNH, we recognize that we need effective change makers now more than ever to lead this transition to a stakeholder-oriented version of capitalism. We are committed to graduating thousands of students in the coming decades, young leaders who will have the confidence and the competence and courage gained through real-world experience in sustainability to create change for the good of all. We achieve our vision at the Changemaker Collaborative by collaborating with community partners to offer a suite of programs that are united by a commitment to connect students to meaningful real-world sustainability experiences and at the same time providing valuable contributions to our community partners. You can get a flavor of our programs on the screen, and we hope you'll take time to learn more about our programs and invite you to follow us on social media and join our monthly email newsletter. We also invite you to save the date for April the 22nd, which is Earth Day. We'll be joined by another amazing business leader and best-selling author, Margaret Heffernan, who will be talking about her new book, Uncharted, and navigating to a sustainable future. She'll be in conversation with several leading business leaders as well. So again, thank you, Deborah and Judy. This has been such a privilege and an honor.
Thank you.
Are amazing role models for me and for so many others, and we bring your insights and your time with us today.
Thank you both so much for having me, and thanks to the whole UNH community that stood behind this and also attended today. I really loved it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Judy. Thanks, Deborah.
Yeah, absolutely. Judy, great to see you and thank you so much.